listening to Pi Radio. This is Mango Masala, the South Asian show. My name's Gerns. I'm joined here by Simran in the studio.
Hi.
And Krissy on live stream.
Hello.
And now we're going to get talking into a show that everyone seems to be talking about at the moment. I think it was Channel 4's one of their top highest viewed not box sets, but you know what I mean, when they release it all at once. Like, it's one of the most viewed series in that sense. It's called It's a Sin, and it basically follows the lives of 5 young adults who live in London throughout the 80s at the height of the HIV AIDS pandemic, basically, because that's what it was. It was basically a pandemic. And yes, Krissy, do you want to maybe give us, like, without too many spoilers, just tell us a bit about the basic premise of the series, basically?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I think we decided to talk about this because I noticed you'd been liking all their stuff on Instagram, and so had I. Yes, It's a Sin was a very, very good show. I've actually watched it twice. It's like a 5-part episode on Channel 4, and as Carlos said, it basically follows the lives of these 4 young adults moving to London, and they're all exploring their sexuality. And it sort of ties in very nicely in terms of, like, it's got like an undertone of like the whole fun of London and all of that, but then a really serious undertone of like HIV and AIDS and how that was becoming more and more prevalent. And it's interesting. It's a time when they didn't actually know what it was at the start. And it actually reminds me a little bit, and I'm not going to give any spoilers away, but it reminds me quite similarly of like what's going on this year with like COVID. Like, a new virus comes about, no one really understands what it's about. There's loads of theories, if it's this, if it's that. And the show is very, very well done in terms of, like, it's a very sad topic, and they could have made it completely, you know, really down and really like drear, but instead they gave it a really like colourful overtone with like the music and the actual scenes and stuff. So yeah, it's a very, very good show. It really, really touched me because I actually didn't know a lot about it, and especially like not being even born in those times, I didn't even realise like this sort of thing happened that much.
Yeah, no, and I think obviously it wasn't that long ago, like the 80s, we made jokes about that, oh yeah, people born in the 80s are old and that, but it actually wasn't like that long ago. And I think the fact that it's a bit of history, very important history, that's kind of just not really covered at all or not really talked about at all. And I think also it was very sad watching it. And I think I knew, like, obviously I'm not claiming to know exactly what it would have been like, but I think I had like an idea of like what it must have been like, but actually watching it, and I think also watching a series that was based in London during the AIDS crisis rather than America. For example, like the musical Rent, I've watched that, like the film version, a number of times, and for people that don't know, that's set in America during the same time at the height of the AIDS pandemic. And there's lots more surrounding that with regards to what happened in America, but no one really talks about what it was like actually living in the UK when this hit. And it was really interesting, like, seeing, because the series is, like I say, it's only 5 episodes, but it basically covers the entirety of the 80s and early 90s pretty much. And it was just interesting seeing the different stages. For example, at the beginning, no one really knows what it is. No one really, it's just this disease that seems to be particularly affecting gay men. And I think it's interesting, and I don't think this is giving any spoilers because I think this is actually a trailer they've released, but one of the main characters, Richie, actually in this trailer, which is actually part of the episode as well, he's basically talking about how AIDS is, or this disease is just, it's a myth, and that it was just created in order for basically people to shun people who are gay even further, because at that time, like I said, it wasn't that long ago, but it pretty homophobic like times, and you see that in the series, and it's really sad because you see how much that actually contributes towards people who come into contact with HIV then decide to keep it to themselves. And it's really similar to what we were talking about before, actually, with regards to these women in India that might have been raped and feel scared of coming forward because of how they'll be treated. It's the same with these gay men in the 80s, or anyone that had it really was scared of coming forward because they thought, oh, this is a disease that's associated with gay men, and they're going to know if I've got this, then they'll know that I have been having sexual relations with gay men, and I don't want anyone to know that because of how much stigma there was behind that. Yeah, it was really, it's like you say, it's a really good watch. There's some really funny moments, there's some really heartwarming moments, but there's also a lot of heartbreak in it, and it's a bit hard to watch in times. But I think the thing that makes it so much more poignant as well is the fact that if anyone's listening to this that thinks they might have come into contact with HIV, or that they are worried about getting it, or if you, for example, you like have heard this and that about it but don't necessarily know what exactly it is, there's so much information out there about it, especially in light of this new series coming out. I think people are talking about it a lot more, but also it's important to emphasize that if you do have HIV, or if you do get HIV, you can still live a long and healthy life now. It's not a death sentence. Krissy, did you know exactly what it is that people
so I find it really interesting because one of my best friends is gay, and so I got a lot of information from him for the last few years, so I got a lot more equipped on understanding it all than I probably had before knowing him. I was probably very ignorant, as I think a lot of people are, but one thing the show didn't really cover, and I think that is really important to know, is you're right, you can have HIV or AIDS now and live very, very long lives, basically the same expectancy now. There's two types of drugs as well, one called PrEP and one called PEP. PrEP is basically you take it daily if you think potentially you might be getting exposed, i.e. if you're having intercourse, unprotected, whatever. And then there's PEP, so if you've met someone and you think you've been exposed to it, in terms of obviously you had intercourse or whatever, you can take PEP for a month after it, and that will stop it transferring to you. Another thing to say is a huge amount of so I think it's 87% of people in the UK right now with HIV are virally suppressed. And what that basically means is, in terms of science, it basically means that they have less than 200 copies of HIV per milliliter of blood. But what that basically means is they take medication after they've been diagnosed for things around 6 months, and the virus then lies dormant, and they have to take these drugs every day, but it's undetectable. So there is literally no risk of you transmitting it to an HIV negative partner. And that is huge. 30 years ago, HIV death sentence, really, really sad if you knew it. And I can't even imagine living knowing that. Whereas now, with science and medication, it's so easily manageable that it's obviously it's a worry. And they say if you catch it in the late stages, that's when it can be deadly. But if you get it early, you can live a very normal life with it. And I feel like the show didn't highlight that, and it should have, because I found a stat, just one last thing is I found a stat that awareness in the UK, only 45% of the UK population know HIV is and isn't transmittable. So basically a lot of people, I think, assume, and kind of why would you know if you weren't really in that life and you didn't know, you would assume it's probably transmittable or it's a death sentence or whatever, but actually it's very, very manageable.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely good that it's definitely important that people understand that. And just coming off what you were saying about what people might believe, or 45% don't, is it 45% don't know that it is both transmissible and non-transmissible? They
do know. 45% know that, so 55% don't know, basically.
Yeah, because I was just wondering, Simran, obviously as Again, this isn't me trying to be like, oh yeah, the young and amongst us, but obviously you're a few years younger than both of us, and also as someone who comes from a South Asian background, what was your knowledge, or what is your knowledge of HIV and AIDS like prior to this? Like, is there anything, or and if you do know anything, is that what you've like sought out yourself rather than actually being educated on it in school? So,
Yeah, I feel like my knowledge of it prior to researching this show, It's a Sin, was extremely limited. I think I did know that it was non-transmissible with the right medication, and also I did a lot of research before about a lot of the stigma attached to it and how people were really ashamed to come out in the 80s about it, and the fact that it was like labeled this disease that only like gay people could get, and there was a lot of like misunderstanding around the whole thing. That's kind of what I knew about it. That was like pretty much the extent of my knowledge. I think a lot of it does reflect on the state of like sex education in schools, that what you do get taught is extremely limited. They teach you really the bare bones of it all, if that, sometimes. And I feel like with proper education in the school system would lead to a lot better awareness of it and the actual facts around it, because I feel like HIV and AIDS is one of those things where people do just believe things that aren't the truth, like the fact that it's only that only gay people can get it, when the truth is that anyone, regardless of your gender or sexuality, age, anything, anyone's vulnerable to it, and stuff. So I think it reflects a lot more on the kind of the way the curriculum's set up, because with the right education, people would definitely know the facts.
definitely. I was gonna ask, what did both of you two think about, because again, this is pre-corona times, which seems like a lifetime ago. There's obviously that primary school in Birmingham where a high proportion of Muslim families weren't very happy because their kids were basically being taught about homosexual relationships, in terms of, and this wasn't sex ed, I don't think. I think this was literally just the idea of love between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman being a thing, being like something that's possible. And I think they were very unhappy about the fact that this was being taught to their kids, so much that there's been like protests and taking their kids out of school, that sort of thing. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that that was like, it's a bit too young for people to be told about that? But then also, obviously, we literally have heterosexuality shoved down our throats from like age zero. So like, can you really argue that? You know what I mean? So like, what are your thoughts on that?
I feel like education, just people knowing the facts and think then the stuff that, like, homosexuality does exist and this is how it works, that's completely harmless. And if anything, that's doing good, not bad. And it's just getting, the facts out there for young kids to learn, which is like so important. And the fact that people would like protest against that kind of just emphasizes, I think, the homophobia that's in our community a lot more. That it's so widely unaccepted, and that people would go as far to like pull their kids out of school or threaten to pull their kids out of school just because they've been taught that homosexual relationships exist, which obviously is like fundamentally wrong. And I think it just does the job of further perpetuating the kind of homophobia that we have in our community, and that obviously doesn't bode well. And I think it would just push young South Asian homosexual people further into the closet. Like, it would just prevent them from wanting to come out, prevent them from being themselves, which obviously has like really negative effects on their mental health, and it can just be like a really horrible experience for those people, and it just further stigmatizes them and just puts them back into a position where they feel like they might not be accepted by not even just society but their own families.
Krissy, what do you think about? Do you think that there is homophobia? It might be subtle, but do you think there's any that exists within the South Asian community, particularly like in the UK? Do you think that's a thing, or do you think that we've moved past that, or like what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think historically, South Asians, and just generally probably the BAME community, have always been ingrained in this society, has been quite homophobic. So I know from like some of my best friends that are gay, and I've had conversations with them, and I've asked them like, who have been the most horrible to you ever, and they always say the Asians and the Black community. But what I will say is I think it is changing in terms of, like, we're all young, right? Our parents, obviously, like the older generation, and we've got our grandparents. And as the generations grow up, we're becoming a lot more, like, open to it, and a lot more, like, I guess, like, not homophobic. So, like, not open to it, but essentially, like, you know, it's just the norm. Like, if someone's gay, they're gay. If someone's not gay, they're not gay. Like, that sort of thing. Whereas I think, like, in the older generations, they're still, it wasn't the done thing, right? Like, it's still like they're remembering their upbringing and how, like, there wasn't many gay people, etc., and it wasn't accepted. Whereas, like, for us now, like, if one of our friends, I would assume this is the case, but if one of our friends basically told us they were gay, we'd be like, okay, cool, like, that's cool. You're still the same person you were. It's just a preference. So I think it is changing, but yes, historically, I think the South Asian community can have and have been very cruel to people that were homosexual.
Yeah, I think the thing that's so sad about that is, as well, is that a lot of in when you talk about historically, if you're gonna say historically, if we go way back to before Britain colonized a lot of these countries, such as India and a lot of African countries, if you go way back in a lot of African countries and Asian countries, homosexuality was actually, like, or gender fluidity was actually a thing, and it was like, it was just accepted, and it was just a way of living. It was actually when Britain went over and colonized these countries, in a lot of cases, that they brought over with them that homophobia, which then transcended into society there, which unfortunately seems to have, for some reason, stuck more strongly with the BAME communities than it does with white communities, which is interesting, because I get what you're saying, because I do think, if I think about someone who's going to be more lenient towards the idea of homosexuality, not that we should have to even say that, but if we are going to say that, I would think that it would be a white community rather than a BAME community. But yeah, it's just sad, like, people that, if you're BAME and you have this, like, homophobia, subtle or not, embedded within you, just think about the fact of, like, where that's actually come from, because if you go way back, like, actually, like we didn't have that, you know what I mean?
Just to add to that, it's like, we are all trying to fight the plight for racism and trying to stop racism in our own cultures, and in the UK, you know, we're all trying to fight to have, like, an equal world. But apparently, like, some people think it doesn't apply to gay people, and I just think that's crazy. Like, how can you want equality when it comes to our skin color, but you don't want equality when it comes to our sexuality?
Yeah, literally.